Let's see here. Devil Survivor 69 says, do you think the recent reports about the state of the women's division in WWE and AEW are concerning about the future of women's wrestling? And then Deddy also says here, is there a way to turn the backstage wrestling drama into a profitable reality television show? I think AEW wants to with All Access. They're like, half kayfabing the stuff, but kind of not really.
Well, based on, the recent tweets, it didn't seem like it was maybe all that kayfabe.
So, yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this, because you and I actually talked this morning about like, hey, should we do like a video on Lufisto, who's been like an indie wrestler for like 2 decades now.
A long time, yeah.
Gave a fairly lengthy interview to Fightful that dropped, I think, yesterday. And she talked about her experiences there at AEW. She was, in line apparently to become a coach there, like a producer / coach situation. Yeah. And she was brought over there to work as an extra, which is what AEW refers to as their enhancement talent. Which I had never heard that used as a term for enhancement talent until AEW.
Yeah.
Do you know? Have you ever heard? I had never heard that before.
I have not heard that before. No.
Like I had heard it from, like we knew a person who was there for a second, and they referred to it as that, and I was like, that's weird. But regardless, whatever. And so we were like, should we talk about it like in the proper? And just full disclosure, I'm going to chop this and probably put it on the channel, because I thought that it was kind of, people want to know our thoughts, people want to know our thoughts about stuff. But it was also the kind of thing where there hasn't been. So she talks about her experiences in AEW about like a year and a half ago when she went.
Yeah, roughly, yeah.
And paints a pretty negative picture.
Yes.
Of what it was like backstage, of communication issues in the company,
lack of structure,
of sort of the cliquey nature of it. And obviously like the entirety of the internet wrestling community sort of, blowing up about it and talking about it a lot. There's a lot of discussion about it. And dude, it's one of those things where it's like, I didn't necessarily feel comfortable and I think there is a difference between us intentionally making a video to talk about this thing, or us responding to a question and sort of reacting, giving you our thoughts about it. Because if we advance a news story, then as opposed to us just, reacting to what we saw, I think there's kind of a difference there, but whatever, maybe not, who knows? So, I mean, the fact of the matter is, it is, number one, what I read was pretty disheartening.
Yes.
But it was also one person's experience from like 18 months ago that hasn't been corroborated necessarily, and there hasn't really been a response to it necessarily from any of the other actors involved in what's going
Dustin
on. Besides Dustin Rhodes.
Responded, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where, I don't know, there's a lot to unpack with what she said. And in fact, some of the stuff that she said was, some of what she said, I was like, why would somebody say this? Like when she was referring to Sky Blue, as she said, she's either really bland or really shy or too scared to talk. And I'm like, that's a shot at somebody. Why is that necessary? So it's like, I don't know. There's just a lot to unpack there and it seems like at this point, kind of an incomplete picture, and it's a picture from like a long time ago, and who knows what's changed since then.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff Lufisto mentioned in her firsthand experience being backstage, kind of lined up with what Swole talked about after she left, specifically the lack of structure. Backstage. Of course, over the last year or so, AEW has endeavored to make some changes in the talent relations department. They brought in people. They had people pull double duty.
Yeah.
They brought in a lot of people since then. So the hope is, and we don't know if this is the case or not, the hope is it's gotten better since as opposed to what it was 18 months ago.
Right. Right.
That's the hope that maybe following Swole's podcast, giving very measured and fair criticism about what it's like backstage in AEW.
Yeah.
That I know Tony Khan, his response on Twitter was way out of bounds.
And it was neither fair nor, measured. Yeah.
Yes. But hopefully, this is probably wishful thinking on my part, there were measures taken to address some of the concerns she expressed.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, dude, the funny thing is, though, it's like common sense will kind of tell you that when you have, for example, on the Blood and Guts show, 88 minutes of programming.
Yep.
And
less than 1 minute is dedicated to the women's division.
Less than 1 minute, right?
Yes.
Like maybe 2 if you count like Britt's entrance. Maybe. If that's like the ratio, and I know it varies week to week. This past week, it had, the women's division had the main event on Dynamite. Mm-hmm. It was the only women's division match on the show. It was about a 10-minute match. Yeah. So you're looking at 78 minutes of non-women's division stuff, 10 minutes of women's division stuff.
Yeah.
And it is simply common sense to know that the women in the women's division aren't going to be happy about that.
Yep. Yep.
When you see, I'm sorry, but when you see, I don't know about you, and I don't think it's projecting, given what we sort of know about the women's division. I don't think it's projecting to say, when you look at Soraya's face and Ruby's face and even Tony's face, who's in the match and the champion, they didn't look terribly happy. People don't really look enthused to be out there.
No. And getting back to the structural issues, whether they've been addressed or not, we don't know.
Yeah.
That's only one aspect of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so even if the structural issues have been addressed, that still doesn't account for Tony Khan showing basically no interest in booking the women's division.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a whole separate problem that needs to be addressed still.
Yeah, right.
Whether there's a structure in place for any talents backstage to communicate their ideas up the ladder, and whatnot, don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But regardless, I mean, the evidence is there on our television screens every week.
Right, yeah.
Tony Khan does not prioritize booking the women's division. No. It hasn't since the very beginning of AEW.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is so much of AEW is just matches in a vacuum as opposed to telling stories. And we've harped on this endlessly.
Yeah.
And I don't know, in my opinion, you're going to have a limited ceiling for growth. But it's if you can continue to get a big money deal out of Warner's, or
there's no incentive to change,
then there's no incentive to change. Nope. It's just like when we would talk endless shit about WWE's creative, even though they were getting $1 billion TV deals, there is no incentive to change. And they didn't until Vince was forced out, and you had a younger mind in Triple H, take over and start actually, giving us characters who understood who they are, and we understood their motivations, and then to see them interact was all very interesting stuff. And that's where we're at right now with WWE.
Exactly. And I know the initial question asked about the state of WWE's women's division too, and state as compared to AEW is vastly better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is.
By leaps and bounds, it is vastly better. However, you had 2 prominent women's feuds, Rhea Ripley, Raquel Rodriguez, Trish Stratus, Becky Lynch, not be on the SummerSlam card due to apparently time constraints. They want to keep the length of the show under a certain time, and they don't want to shortchange matches for the sake of fitting in this apparently somewhat arbitrary time spot they have now.
Yeah.
And so Worked Wrestling had a tweet yesterday that said, quote, "There were growing frustrations backstage at WWE regarding the handling of the women's division. And Rhea has, I think through some, it's not Twitter anymore, post likes, I guess what you call them now, expressing some measure of frustration about not being on the card." And it's in a way, it's kind of the opposite of what's going on in AEW, where in AEW, there's really not a whole lot of stories being told in the women's division. Now in WWE, there's an abundance of stories being told in the women's division. And and some of them are getting shortchanged due to apparently limited space on these pay-per-views.
Yeah, it's ill-used space. I mean, I know you and I had a little debate about it, and I totally understand your point. But like, Drew McIntyre wasn't even there for the go home. You know, like Drew seems like I'm not going to say an afterthought, but like he's going to lose to Gunther.
Yeah,
he wasn't on the go home. No. This could look. I get your point about the Intercontinental Championship. It could main event Raw. Like a 25-minute match, Gunther versus Drew McIntyre is a drawing 25-minute main event on Raw. I don't argue with that. And Becky versus Trish, if you take Becky versus Trish, to me, it is a higher profile feud than Gunther Drew.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I agree with that 1,000%.
And so I'm fine with the time that they have allotted on the show because I like those shorter shows. You pull one of the matches that really doesn't have a lot of heat behind it. And that's Gunther Drew. And you put in Becky versus Trish because that's got heat.
And the only reason I'm guessing the Slim Jim Battle Royal is on there is because Slim Jim cut him a huge check.
And that's the thing that you can't be naive about.
Yeah.
Is Slim Jim's going to be there because apparently it's the most lucrative deal they've ever cut. Mr. Dope yesterday had a great idea, put that on SmackDown. But the problem is, and I would be in favor of that from a creative standpoint.
I mean, also you get more eyeballs on it. I mean, there's 2.5-3 million people watch SmackDown. How many people order the premium live event?
I don't know, but I also understand that the premium spot on a premium live event, which happens once a month, from a business standpoint, I understand why they're doing it and why.
Oh, I do too. Yeah,
and why. Having them remove that is too big of an ask because it's a giant paycheck they're getting and they're a business. And the same thing, sadly, can be said about Logan Paul. Look, would I love Raw to be 2 hours again? Yeah. From a business standpoint, it's stupid because they make so much more money off of a 3-hour Raw. And so from a business standpoint, you can't ask them to do certain things like that. But you look at the card, Gunther Drew doesn't need to be on there. The Intercontinental Championship will be fine. It'll be at the next pay-per-view. It'll be fine. But like to remove Becky Trish, which is a high-profile thing that should absolutely be on a pay-per-view. I mean, that would be my solution.
Yeah. There's probably a handful of matches you can move around and whatnot to get Trish and Becky on the
absolutely.
And it totally should be. And the fact that it's not is a bit of a head scratcher.
Play Roman Reigns' theme music at 1.5 speed. Like, do we need the 20-minute entrance? Do we really
get him on one of those
that?
Carts they had at WrestleMania 3 so he gets to the ring faster.
Right. Exactly. So like there are things you can do to fit the matches in. Yes. So I don't know, man. I mean, going back to it, it is, look, and I hope that like WWE, even though I do firmly believe they are much better at booking their women's division, I hope the women never settle. And I hope that there are prominent men in the company arguing we need the women to be on the show. I hope Seth Rollins is like, hey, my wife should be on this fucking show. And it's kind of bullshit that she's not.
Yep.
And it's the same thing in AEW. Like, hey, how many podcasts did Dax produce where he was bitching about their own, usage, you know? And where was he? Did he do any podcast segments on like how they treat the women's division? Has CM Punk said one thing about how they treat the women's division? He spent a lot of time on social media talking shit about Dave Meltzer. Did he talk any shit about how they use the women's division?
I didn't see it.
I didn't see it either.
I haven't heard anything about Chris Jericho or Kenny Omega or John Moxley or any of the leaders in AEW stand up and saying, we need to do better. We need to be better. Tony Khan, you need to be better about booking the women's division. Give them more time. Tell more stories.
Yeah.